This video isn't a paid promotion from Samsung or Google or Lenovo or Motorola or whoever makes mobile devices and or laptops. I'm not advocating for or against any multinational technology manufacturer, although the older people on our staff do want me to advocate for Nokia, thanks to their 3310 cell phone from the 2000s, which they claim might be the best mobile device ever created. A tank of a phone with a 2-month-long battery life that they swear could still work after getting ran over by a semi-truck. Unlimited custom faceplates, and the greatest mobile game of all time, Snake. It seems like it was before the dawn of time, but it was only just a few decades ago that Apple used to be this beloved, quirky underdog of a company. It was a startup that famously came out of a garage, started by a college dropout whose vision for the brand was to, quote, think different. Back in the 80s and 90s, if you used an Apple instead of an IBM computer, you belonged to the counterculture. You went against the grain. It's amazing to think how much times have changed. Now, if you use anything but an Apple product, you're poor, apparently. You're judged by the color of your message bubble, not the content of your 140 characters. You're ridiculed for your default emojis, which, sorry, Android users, but speaking objectively, they're much uglier. And Apple's fine with that. In fact, they may actually welcome it. The United States government sure thinks so. In an official complaint filed by the Department of Justice, quote, Apple affirmatively undermines the quality of rival smartphones. The formal report alludes to the green text bubble being associated with limited functionality on Apple's mobile OS, like grainy, pixelated videos, messages that can't be edited, and conversations that aren't encrypted. The report goes on to say, quote, this signals to users that rival smartphones are lower quality because the experience of messaging friends and family who do not own iPhones is worse, even though Apple, not the rival smartphone, is the cause of the degraded user experience. Imagine your product getting to such a degree that the government is arguing that you are making the competitors look bad on purpose. If there's any doubt that this isn't a ploy to push product, consider this. When a reporter asked Apple CEO Tim Cook if the company could please fix these issues because, quote, not to make it personal, but I can't send my mom certain videos, Cook simply responded, quote, buy your mom an iPhone. That's a pretty clear and strong message from the top, underpinning the somewhat ridiculous cultural blue-green bubble debate as a microcosm of a much bigger issue. To quote Myasha Tasnim in her white paper in the European Journal of Business Management, Apple, quote, simply does not want to beat the competition, but destroy the competition. True or not, even being accused of this behavior is ironic because this is the very thing Apple once urged their customers to fight against. In its now iconic Orwellian Super Bowl ad that put the company on the map 40 years ago, hundreds of blank-faced workers all wearing the same gray uniforms watched a godlike figure preach about conformity. A woman with bright orange shorts and bleach blonde hair runs into the room and heroically smashes the screen with a sledgehammer, breaking the men out of their trance as the voiceover says, on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. But the company that once rallied against the idea of the man now nets nearly $400 billion in revenue annually. But nobody builds trillions in market value in such a short span of time without angering a few people along the way. Sometimes it's regulators, sometimes it's politicians, sometimes it's other executives. And while Apple has irked all of those people, they also have a history of purposefully doing it to a pretty important group that businesses normally would do anything to keep happy. It's customers. And the thing is, as paradoxical as it seems, it's working. Apple's priority has never really been to release products with the most impressive feature set. Rather, they built a name for themselves by carefully developing products that, according to their marketing, just worked. They limited options and configurations, led by Steve Jobs' belief that consumers needed someone to tell them what they wanted rather than choosing for themselves. And maybe he was right. I mean, Apple has created a company with almost certainly the most brand loyalty in the consumer tech space. The meteoric rise of Apple's stock price and booming sales came not so much from innovation or breakthrough features or the most customizable products, but from distinct, splashy products with impressive marketing that created a loyal army of supporters. But eventually, even the most devoted followers of the fruit would have their faith tested, one scandal and controversy at a time. So hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about the theory of Apple's planned obsolescence. And I want to get this out of the way and make this very clear. I am not accusing anyone or promoting anyone in this video. These are all things that other people have said, and I'm just speculating, giving my opinion, which should not be treated as fact. Do the research for yourself. Your discretion. Don't try this at home. Anything I can say right now to not get sued. But I believe this to be an interesting topic and one worth talking about. And as long as you don't tell the tech conglomerates that I started this, I think it's a topic worth discussing. There's a lot of moves the company's made over the years that probably wouldn't fly if it didn't have the Apple name attached. So we're going to talk about a few of those today. That is, again, my opinion and not stated fact. And if it is, other people said it first. We are going to go ahead and get into it. But as always, thank you for watching. So to kick this off, let's start with AntennaGate. AntennaGate in 2010 was the first of Apple's major controversies. What began as an issue with the iPhone 4's antenna hardware design reached a climax when Steve Jobs essentially told people, "You're holding the phone wrong," rather than admit fault. This was the first time consumers began to openly question Apple's legitimacy on such a scale, which was an especially big deal given the iPhone's rapidly growing success. By the time it reached its fourth generation, the iPhone was one of the most popular smartphones in the world. The first gen iPhone was announced in January of 2007. Apple teased the device with a 30-second television ad featuring quick clips of famous film and TV characters like Lucy from I Love Lucy, Betty Rubble, and Ron Burgundy picking up a phone and saying some version of hello. It ended with a product shot against a black background showcasing a phone that was 99% screen. Though LG quietly was the first to market with a phone that featured a capacitive touchscreen, there was something about Apple's version that was intriguing, enticing, and felt like something that had never been done before. The major smartphone companies that dominated the market at the time, like BlackBerry and Palm Pilot, didn't know what to expect. Neither did Nokia, who in 2007 was hands down the undisputed global leader in the mobile phone market with a 40% market share. When the iPhone dropped that summer, it was a game changer. It was part phone, part iPod. It had an LCD touchscreen that was more vibrant than most people's TVs, and due to the aforementioned capacitive screen technology, didn't suffer from the same clunky, inconsistent touch interface that plagued the LCD screens of pretty much every other smartphone at the time. But perhaps most noteworthy of all was the phone's complete lack of a physical keyboard, a feature that many phone makers saw as a death stroke for Apple's fledgling smartphone. There was no replacement for tactile, real physical buttons, they felt, and so smartphones willingly chose to sacrifice valuable screen real estate in order to house those keyboards, or else employed complicated solutions like slide-out mechanisms that made the phones thick, heavy, and susceptible to broken parts. The iPhone, on the other hand, had only one button on the front and included something Steve Jobs dubbed multi-touch, which allowed input from more than one point of contact on the screen at a time. This was somewhat revolutionary, as the vast majority of phone screens only registered input from one contact point, one index finger or thumb at a time. Jobs was vocally opposed to the stylus, or little pins used to interact with certain touchscreens on smart devices, including Palm Pilots. If you had a Nintendo DS, you know what I'm talking about. And during the iPhone's announcement, Jobs proclaimed the best stylus was the one you were born with, your finger. Users simply had to tap, pinch, or swipe to interact with their screens. The iPhone was fast and responsive with no noticeable input lag, thanks to Apple's use of their own silicon. This was not always the case at the time with mobile devices in 2007. Many people were still using phones with black and white screens and monophonic ringtones, and phone plans offered a limited number of minutes and charged users per text. While the first generation iPhone notoriously lacked video recording capabilities, a copy and paste function for text, an app store, and the ability to send photos or videos through text, none of that mattered. The iPhone succeeded thanks to the things it could do well, doing them better than arguably any other phone on the market. And it did so in a sleek, sexy package with a brilliant marketing strategy showing it to the world. According to Mark Webber of the Computer History Museum in the heart of Silicon Valley, quote, "I don't think there's any question that iPhone set the standard that really almost all phones have followed since then. So it isn't overstating it when I say that the iPhone was truly revolutionary. It made any cell phone or smartphone that came before it look like a dinosaur. With each generation, the iPhone became more and more popular, with the upcoming release of the iPhone 4 the most anticipated of all. This generation was going to have by far the most dramatic redesign yet, and to this day remains one of the sexiest. The 4 replaced the curved plastic body of the 3G and 3GS in favor of a thinner, more squared off design, with the stainless steel band that wrapped around the outside and, for the first time, an all-glass back. The screen had such a high pixel density that Apple did what Apple does and gave the feature a catchy new name. They called it the Retina display. Apple sold 4 million units in the first weekend alone. The first iPhone had taken 74 days just to reach 1 million. The iPhone 4 was unquestionably a massive success. With an all-new, even faster processor than before, Wired magazine proclaimed this new generation made its, quote, predecessor look like toys. Grip it in your hand, the review said, and the iPhone 4 feels like the phone of the future. And as it turns out, they were right. But the writer of that article probably wasn't left-handed, or they might not have had such high praise. Lefty iPhone 4 owners were experiencing a concerning issue that they couldn't explain. As one user on Reddit would summarize, quote, the iPhone 4 was just so different in a lot of ways to everything else out there. It felt so solid, the screen was brilliant, the speed was definitely noticeable. It introduced FaceTime. It had it all and went on to sell hundreds of millions of units with an antenna that was apparently worse than Hitler. All right, well, that statement's probably exaggerating a little bit. I don't know what the antenna did, but it couldn't be that bad, right? Despite all the iPhone 4's impressive new features and hardware, the phone part of this smartphone contained a pretty serious design flaw. A large part of the phone's antenna was fitted into the stainless steel band around the outside of the phone. Some customers found that when they held the phone, especially in their left hand, quote, the bars that signaled a connection to a wireless network seemed to vanish, and occasionally, calls were dropped entirely. The issue was caused by the user's hand bridging the gap between the two parts of the antenna, completing the circuit and shorting the signal. Instead of admitting that their phone was fundamentally flawed, Apple brushed the issue aside, calling the situation overblown, since only 0.5% of its customers had called in to complain and less than 2% returned their phones. 0.5% doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, Apple sold millions of these, roughly 60 million iPhone 4s by the time all was said and done. 0.5% of 60 million is still 300,000 people with a phone that couldn't make calls whenever you held it in your left hand. And not to mention, that's only assuming every single person who experienced the problem had called in to complain. The total number of affected users was likely way higher. And this is where Apple's growing success would become a bit of a double-edged sword. 0.5% of users experiencing major hardware problems was much less of an issue when it happened to the 3 million or so Macs that were sold in 1998. As Apple's market share rapidly scaled upwards, the problem scaled along with it. But Apple didn't designate this as a hardware issue. In fact, they barely considered it a problem at all. The issue, they said, was being caused by the people using the phone. And their advice to the loyal customers making their company rich was essentially, stop holding it that way. And in case you think I'm exaggerating, judge for yourself. Their official response reads, quote, gripping any phone will result in some attenuation of its antenna performance, with certain places being worse than others depending on the placement of the antenna. This is a fact of life for every wireless phone. If you ever experience this on your iPhone 4, avoid gripping it in the lower left corner in a way that covers both sides of the black strip in the metal band, or simply use one of many available cases. Which I just want to mention, it's rich for one that beyond people, and yes, I have an iPhone, hypocrite, whatever, beyond people holding it, the normal way most people hold phones, their solution is to buy another Apple product and get a case. But for the first time since Steve Jobs returned as CEO, a press release and an explanation weren't enough to rally the fanboys and fangirls to silence the critics. People were not happy, and it didn't take long for the internet to react the way the internet does. Apple's response went viral in the worst way, appearing as a meme that summarized their press release with a blunt but not entirely inaccurate sentiment. You're holding it wrong. Memes were so much simpler back then. Like, you could show your mom this and she would get it. Imagine doing that with literally anything you see on Twitter now. Wow. Popular tech publications skewered Apple. CNET immediately published an article titled Poking Holes in Apple iPhone's 4 Antenna Explanation. Gizmodo, a notoriously and heavily pro-Apple tech blog, took it a step further with their article, Apple, AntennaGate, and Why It's Time to Move On. Not a lot of room left to wiggle on that title, huh? In the piece, they criticized CEO Steve Jobs, saying, quote, "That's why you'll never get a straight-up apology from Apple. They're smart enough to know that would open the door to a class action suit and too proud to throw themselves on their sword over a single, irritating if minor issue. It's just not their style and never will be while Jobs is in charge." Man, this is the way people speak about like dictators, like political opponents. In the mainstream, CNN published an article with the headline, "Got an iPhone 4? You may need duct tape." Everyone's so fired up. In which they suggested a workaround patch. Quote, "Which sounds like it'd be more appropriate for kitchen plumbing than for a phone that retails for $200 to $300. And according to ABC News, quote, "The backlash reached its peak when the trusted organization Consumer Reports reached their verdict on the iPhone 4. That verdict? Not recommended." The blowback became so loud that Steve Jobs was forced to don one of his iconic black turtlenecks and a pair of gray New Balance sneakers and took the stage to hold a press conference addressing the situation directly. At the event, Jobs finally took accountability for the mistake of his then $200 billion company. He said, quote, "We're not perfect, and the phones aren't perfect either, but we want all our users to be happy." Quite a change of tone from the "you're holding it wrong" company. As a proposed solution, Jobs announced free bumper cases, a rectangular rubber-like product that wrapped around the stainless steel frame of the phone for all iPhone owners. The bumper case would insulate the phone's antenna from the conductive surface of people's hands. The cases actually did resolve the antenna issue, but that wasn't really the point. In 2010, Bloomberg News revealed that Apple had known that there was an issue during the phone's design process. A senior antenna expert at the company tried warning management that there would be issues moving forward with the design, but Apple moved forward anyway, choosing form over function and avoiding the hit to their bottom line that a redesign certainly would have caused. If making money's the goal, well, that gamble paid off. Apple's stock price would grow 150% during the run of the iPhone 4. Nearly a year later, the company would have to address another controversy. In 2011, a group of security researchers discovered that iPhones were tracking and recording its users' location data and storing it in an unencrypted file on the phone. This wasn't an opt-in situation. No one that used the phone knew this was happening, and similar to AntennaGate, this controversy would come to be known as LocationGate. Which is still funny to me that every controversy, like ever since Watergate, uses the word gate as if gate had something to do with like the nature of controversies itself, where in reality the hotel that all the Nixon stuff happened at was just called Watergate. So it doesn't even apply, but I guess we're just going to keep calling everything blank gate forever. When the researchers who found the file revealed their findings, the outrage transcended past just the iPhone user. No matter what brand of phone was in a purse or pocket, people used this incident as evidence that their fears of being tracked and having their privacy violated were warranted. iPhone users specifically grew concerned that they could be vulnerable to stalkers or anyone wanting to harm them, and there was no opting out. It could not be turned off. Steve Jobs again had to put out an announcement. This time, it was a hard denial in the form of an emailed response to a contributor on the popular website Mac Rumors, stating, quote, "We, Apple, don't track anyone, and that the info circulating around is false. Apple is not tracking the location of your iPhone. Apple has never done so and has no plans ever to do so." Again, their response, which clearly wasn't an apology or even an "oops, my bad," wasn't taken at face value. It made people angrier until Apple amended its response to say they weren't tracking and storing users' data on purpose, which that's a completely different statement than the previous one. They said the iOS location cache was a bug, unintentionally collecting more Wi-Fi and cell tower locations than it actually needed for purposes of improving location services. Okay, so it went from "we're not doing that, we've never done that," to "we are doing that, but it's on accident," to "we are doing that, but it's to help our location service." Like, it's 2026. We're all way too familiar with everyone is spying on us and tracking our data all the time, forever. That's just how life is. But I mean, if you're gonna like incorporate us into an Orwellian surveillance state, can you at least be nice about it? From here, the issue became global. When a South Korean iPhone customer sued Apple about this issue, regulators found Apple culpable and fined them, making them pay out a whopping $946 to the customer. That's right. Someone sued Apple, again, over $200 billion at this time. Someone sued them for tracking their location, and Apple paid them about the price of a phone. That's right, everyone. Justice has been served. Though the monetary amount was largely a principled stand, privacy advocates used LocationGate and Apple's large user base to their advantage to spread an overreaching, broader message to the mainstream. Don't be fooled. Smartphones aren't just for entertainment. According to Christina Bonington of Wired Magazine, they're, quote, eroding privacy in the always connected digital age. Which, yeah, Christina, how right you are. Apple would only last about a year until their next big iPhone-related controversy. In 2012 came the iPhone 5, and along with it, ScuffGate. Again, just throwing gate at the end of everything. You get a gate, I get a gate. We're all gates now. Turns out the iPhone 5's new space black finish could be scratched extremely easily by a set of keys, credit cards, or coins. All things that typically live in a pants pocket or purse next to the phone. Again, Apple's response was dismissive, with their chief marketing officer hand-waving concerns and using their favorite explanation. It's not a bug, it's a feature. The reply was, quote, any aluminum product may scratch or chip with use, exposing its natural color. That's normal. Hey, my iPhone keeps getting scratched up. Yes. But other brands' black smartphones didn't seem to have this big of an issue. Moreover, Apple should have anticipated the problem, given it had already experienced similar issues with its iPod Nano, which led to a $22 million settlement in 2009. But Apple kept releasing iPhones and continued to face controversy with each new model. This time, the issue was a structural flaw with the iPhone 6 in fall of 2014, their biggest yet. I feel like iPhone 6 was also when, like, the culture, at least when I was younger, the culture around iPhones and Apple started to shift. Because I remember when the iPhone started coming out and they were the biggest thing ever, and it's all anyone wanted to talk about. And I remember, I feel like it peaked around the 5C. At least that was like my first phone. So I remember the 5C fondly. I got like the lime green one, and all my friends got like the different cool colored ones. And I feel like after that, that was like the apex, and then it started to become like surveillance state. Apple's watching us, like purposefully bad products, whatever. But the 5C, that was a special moment. But I remember when the iPhone 6 came out feeling like, do I really need another one? And again, I was like 13. So normally the answer would be yes, but that goes to show how much the sentiment started to shift. For me, at least, the sentiment started to shift. As mentioned, the iPhone 6 was the biggest yet, but I feel that's when people started to talk about the sentiment shifting. And by biggest yet, I mean literally. The iPhone 6 not only featured a larger screen than the previous model, but for the first time was also available as a separate plus-sized model, the iPhone 6 Plus. Whereas the previous phone screen came in at 4 inches, the base Model 6's was 4.7. The 6 Plus added an entire 1.5 inches on top of that, totaling 5.5 inches of screen real estate. And within weeks, concerns and complaints about the phone's pliability emerged, becoming what would be dubbed BendGate. The gates with, okay, whatever. The newly minted screen and body size of both models would be the culprit. The 6 Plus, at over 37% larger than the previous model, along with its all-aluminum construction, was susceptible to developing a slight curve over time. Just for being in the one place most people keep their phones for a majority of the time, their pocket. In extreme examples, the glass would break or separate from the phone's chassis. Apple responded by claiming they had only heard of 9 complaints, which was a difficult lie to maintain in the burgeoning age of social media. Customers flooded social media to post images of their newly curved phones as proof that there were far more than 9 of them. Also, you're Apple. 9? Really? That's like, if 9 of your customers exploded, you would never know. But you've only heard of 9 people talk about the bent phone? Okay. But Apple, in typical fashion, didn't apologize. In fact, they doubled down, defending their design process, saying both the 6 and 6 Plus underwent extensive durability tests. Quote, a development cycle including 3-point bending, pressure point cycling, sit, torsion, and user studies. And didn't find any problem with bending or pliability. Hard to find something you're not looking for. A few years later, during a 2018 lawsuit related to touchscreen failures, excerpts of Apple's internal test documents were unsealed. The test documents revealed what most people already assumed. Apple knew this would be an issue. Language in the lawsuit read, quote, Apple's internal testing determined that the iPhone 6 was 3.3 times more likely to bend than the iPhone 5S, and that the iPhone 6 Plus was 7.2 times more likely to bend than the iPhone 5S. BendGate had other issues lying in wait. It wasn't immediately noticeable, but after a couple years of use, some iPhone 6s developed something called touch disease, a flickering gray bar at the top of the touchscreen. In many cases, this evolved into a touchscreen that didn't respond to touch whatsoever. Independent repair experts who specialized in smartphones and micro soldering confirmed this was related to the phone's pliability. The phone's Touch IC chip, which is responsible for relaying touches registered on the screen to the brain of the phone, would separate from the logic board due to normal, everyday use and a faulty design. One of the experts, Mark Schaefer, gave some advice on how to prevent touch disease. Quote, really all you can do is avoid any activity that would cause the phone to flex. Don't drop it. Definitely don't put it in any case that requires you to apply force to the phone to get it in and out of the case. Don't put it in your back pocket. Don't put it in your front pocket if it's a tight pocket. Actually, don't put it in any pocket. Not helping the situation was the fashion of the times. Skinny jeans. With a tighter fit within users' pocket than typical jeans, iPhones were pressed even more closely against the legs and butts of Apple users than ever before. It was a disaster in the making. Apple maintained that any instances of display flickering or multi-touch issues were the result of a phone being, quote, dropped multiple times on a hard surface. Once again, the response is, it's your fault, while gaslighting the public about how much their phones actually became damaged. It truly does feel like an abusive relationship cycle. Like we get love bombed and then we're harassed. And then when we start to go away, oh, look, a new iPhone. It'll be nice to us this time. After enough public backlash, Apple announced a targeted repair program, saying they would only charge customers $149 to fix out-of-warranty phones that exhibited this issue. You know, only $149. And while they never admitted there was a flaw in their design, they would later acknowledge engineering changes to the following generation of phones that seemed to address this. While there was a class action lawsuit brought against Apple as a result of BendGate, a judge denied the suit's certification, and Apple avoided having to make a broader payout. 2016 brought another class action lawsuit against Apple. This one didn't carry the Gate moniker, thank God, and was simply referred to as Error 53. Software updates are typically just a small inconvenience, but with Error 53, the update was more than annoying. When users were upgrading their iPhones from iOS 9.2.1, as the little progress bar finished its journey across the screen, phones would stop, shut off, and never turn back on again. Completely bricked, the phones became totally unusable. More in line with Apple's claims regarding previous issues, Error 53 actually was a somewhat rare occurrence. It only happened under a very specific set of circumstances. If an iPhone customer had their home button repaired at an unofficial or third-party repair shop, the Touch ID sensor under the button would no longer match the phone, triggering a security lockdown and disabling the phone entirely upon updating the firmware. While Apple argued this was a crucial security feature, which is probably true, it would make sense if the phone was designed in a way that if someone was trying to meddle with it, it would shut down, not allowing them to get information. Many saw this as just another example of Apple's anti-competitive behavior. In essence, Apple was punishing customers for taking their phones in for repair and giving their hard-earned money to someone other than Apple. Again, the idea of it being a security feature makes sense, but not if that security feature stops phones that people just took to get fixed. Moreover, the existence of competitively affordable repair options meant customers were less likely to purchase their brand's warranty service, AppleCare, a highly lucrative program for them. So it's real convenient that if people try to get it fixed at anyone that isn't you, the phone locks up. Australia's consumer watchdog, the Australian Competitive and Consumer Commission, went so far as to carry out a sting operation against Apple. Investigators, posing as iPhone customers, called 13 Apple retailers and told them that their speakers stopped working after a non-Apple third party replaced their screens. In each call, Apple's response was nearly identical, telling the customer that because they had gone to a third party for screen repair, Apple was no longer liable for repairs of an unrelated component under Australian consumer protection law. After the ACCC shared the results of their sting, Apple criticized the operation, claiming the responses weren't breaches of contract or law because, quote, consumer law does not exist in hypothetical circumstances. Of course, the service reps didn't know the claims were hypothetical at the time they rejected them, so it's a pretty weak argument if you ask me. I mean, the government carries out this whole operation to see if Apple will deny service because someone did another service to their phone, and Apple's response is, well, these were make-believe scenarios anyway. To be clear, I'm not comparing Apple to child predators. I'm not in any way. But it's funny how that's the same logic that gets used in like traditional sting operations, like on To Catch a Predator and stuff like that, when people get busted for talking to underage kids and they're like, well, the kid never existed, right? So really, because it was a hypothetical child, it shouldn't count. It's like Apple's doing that, but with phone repairs. Not claiming the child predator thing. Again, please do not sue me. But as always, Apple eventually folded, releasing a software update that fixed Error 53. They also claimed Error 53 was only intended for internal testing, and that it somehow made its way to the final product, which again is different than what they said the first time. The first thing they said was, oh, this is like a security feature. And then when they have to backtrack, they're like, well, it was a feature that was never meant to be added in the first place. It's an imaginary feature, a hypothetical one, if you will. All of this led to what was perhaps Apple's biggest iPhone controversy yet, BatteryGate. Of course, as soon as we get away from the gate thing, they pull us back in. BatteryGate essentially boiled down to one idea that was discovered by developers at Geekbench in December of 2017, planned to ensure that older iPhone models would begin to perform significantly worse over time. For years, there had been and continue to be quiet rumblings like anecdotes, complaints on forums, and circumstantial evidence that various Apple devices ranging from phones to computers to iPods would suddenly perform noticeably worse upon receiving certain software updates. If you've ever owned an Apple product, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, allegedly. According to rumors, following these updates, Apple products would suddenly lag more or die sooner than they did before or suffer from slower connections. And while Apple defenders on Reddit love to explain away these issues with frequently used excuses, like, for example, that your iPhone is indexing after an update, temporarily slowing it down and impacting battery life, not everyone was convinced. The prevailing theory has been that Apple engages in something just about every tech company has been accused of at some point: planned obsolescence. In other words, intentionally tanking the performance of old products to encourage consumers to ditch their old devices and upgrade to the shiny new one. When your old MacBook struggles to load your favorite websites, or your phone no longer lasts all day without a charge, you're likelier to plunk down an extra $1,000 or so for the new model. But until 2017, the problem was that no one could actually prove this was the case. Older devices run slow, batteries lose juice. These are all facts of life. And anyone believing that a software update suddenly impacted their device was just imagining things. Indexing. It's always the indexing. Or at least, that's what Apple fans insisted. So when the news about BatteryGate broke, thousands of iPhone users suddenly felt validated. Here was proof that Apple was intentionally slowing down phones as they got older, without telling their customers they were doing it. Yet again, no opting out, no toggle, no notification, no announcement. Apple tried to explain their reasoning. Quote, lithium-ion batteries become less capable of supplying peak current demands when they age over time, which can result in the device unexpectedly shutting down to protect its electronic components. In other words, when your battery's life fell below a certain threshold, the phone would become slow as a means of protecting itself. Once again, it's not a bug, it's a feature that's actually better for you. Stupid. But the good people at Geekbench went into further detail on a technical level. Quote, the problem is due in part to a change in iOS. The difference between versions is too abrupt to be just a function of battery condition. I believe, as do others, that Apple introduced a change to limit performance when battery condition decreases past a certain point. Accusations of planned obsolescence became incredibly hard to deny. Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond novels, wrote in Goldfinger, quote, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence. The third time, it's enemy action. And while it might be a bit extreme to call Apple the enemy, they certainly aren't your friend. In an effort to save face and win back what trust they could, Apple launched another targeted program. This time, they would replace the batteries of iPhones that were out of warranty for $29 instead of the usual $79. That's right, you think that Apple may be messing with your battery so you buy a new one? you get a $50 discount. What do you say to that? No, it's not free. You still have to pay for it. But it's $50 off. You're welcome. According to an Apple insider, they only expected to replace 1 to 2 million batteries under this program. In the end, they ended up replacing 11 million. In the US alone, nearly 30 BatteryGate related class action lawsuits were filed against Apple, on the grounds that Apple failed to be transparent and customers were forced to pay for repairs or buy new phones. In 2020, Apple eventually settled for $500 million. Each individual who filed a claim through the class action received a check of, wait for it, $25. That's right, $25. Hey, if you and a friend who were also on the class action got together, you could afford the discount for the new battery. You could pay the difference of the discount. You're welcome. Basically, Apple bought each affected customer a beer and a burger, or a couple movie tickets with no popcorn, in exchange for not apologizing. A coalition of attorneys general, which I think attorneys general is the correct way to say it, but it feels like it should be attorney generals, right? Like the plural of attorney general. But I guess it's attorneys general for some reason. Anyway, a coalition of them from 34 different states also looked into this and concluded that Apple, quote, acted deceptively by hiding the shutdown and slowdown issues, which then led to, quote, boosted iPhone sales potentially by millions of devices per year. Apple agreed to pay out $113 million to the states involved, which went to fund attorney fees and future consumer protection investigations. So you had problems with your phone, but don't worry, Apple paid the state. You get $25. Have fun. By the end of BatteryGate, Apple was out nearly $1 billion in program cost and legal fees and had to make new commitments to transparency. They announced that they would be introducing a new performance management system so they could, quote, reduce performance impacts from battery aging, which is why your iPhones now have a whole battery health section in their settings and sometimes ask you before it charges past 80%. They also sold more than 800 million iPhones during that span of time, which at this point retailed for roughly $1,000 a phone. So they seem to be doing all right. At this point, every time there was a flaw in an Apple product, no matter how small, people yelled and stomped. And for a few years, Apple listened. When people complained that the front-facing camera on the XS model was making their selfies look overly airbrushed, BeautyGate as it was called, Apple quickly adjusted the HDR feature in an iOS update without making much of a fuss. When some people noticed that their phones didn't automatically start charging when it was plugged in with the screen off, ChargeGate, Apple again fixed the issue in an update right away without complaining about the complainers. But Apple's other products got in on the gate action too. Customers who purchased a MacBook Pro between 2012 and 2015 noticed, quote, splotches, streaks, and other surface anomalies on their screen. This was referred to as StainGate. Apple initially told customers that cosmetic damages aren't covered by warranty, but when StainGate.org, a website petitioning for justice, found some traction, Apple must have remembered that they were still in reputation cleanup mode. They swiftly instituted a quality program to replace affected laptops. FlexGate in the gates are driving me up a wall. FlexGate in 2019 took a little more coaxing. This was an issue, again, with the Pro series of MacBooks, notably those that were manufactured in 2016. Users noticed that the bottom part of their screen was suffering from intermittent backlighting, making screens look a lot like stage lighting at a theater. According to third-party repair experts, this issue stemmed from a, quote, weak and fragile flex cable that can experience wear and tear with repeated opening and closings. A class action lawsuit was filed, and the ruling judge declared Apple, quote, knowingly sold the laptops with the defect. A lawsuit took things a step further, alleging that Apple, quote, attempted to cover any evidence and deliberately deleted comments and threads from its Apple support community forum. However, in July of 2021, the case was dismissed. According to Apple Insider, U.S. District Judge Edward Davila concluded that, quote, the plaintiffs had failed to show that the issue was a safety hazard, nor prove the allegation that Apple concealed knowledge of the problem. Apple did eventually launch a targeted repair program, but only specifically for the 13-inch 2016 models. Observant Apple customers noted that the 2018 MacBook Pros didn't seem to have the issue, which means Apple silently fixed it for their later models. In the eyes of many, a quiet admission of guilt. Apple's AirPods joined the party in 2019 for their design and quality issues. The Pro Gen 1 models retailed for $249, and for that price, customers believed they were getting headphones that had a superior sound. But, as yet another class action lawsuit would go on to say, these AirPods actually had, quote, known audio defects that can cause the headphones to exhibit crackling or static sounds, a loss of bass sounds, or an increase in background noise. The lawsuit also alleged that Apple, quote, continued to sell the devices for hundreds of dollars a pair after their release, even though Apple has admitted to the audio issue itself. Apple didn't alert their customers that this was happening, aside from a page on their website that users couldn't find unless they specifically looked for it. What Apple did do was offer to replace anyone's AirPods that were having problems, but they gave them the exact same model. So many customers continue to experience the same problem as before. Reynold's left a note that this exact thing happened to him, and they were replaced under Apple Care, and the new ones did work. So it seemed for some, they did get a model with the issue changed, and in others, it was simply the same problem. Recently, customers started to complain about the AirPods Pro 1 and 2 models, saying that the noise canceling feature was getting worse. Many on Reddit claimed that the feature was experiencing significant downgrades along with certain firmware updates, once again fueling suspicion of intentional obsolescence to prompt consumers to upgrade. Only a few months after the alleged noise-canceling ruining software updates, Apple announced the release of the AirPods Pro 3, claiming they offer the, quote, world's best in-ear active noise cancellation, and up to 4 times more active noise cancellation than original AirPods Pro and AirPods 4 with active noise cancellation. Well, if you want the new headphones to sound even better than the old ones, making the old ones worse certainly allows you to pump up the numbers in your claims. Allegedly. Not that that would allegedly work. Allegedly, that could be what could hypothetically be done to make it sound better. Again, don't sue me. 4 times better is more impressive sounding than twice as good. And then there's the good old planned obsolescence. Making the old ones worse will encourage the people who own them to suddenly be less satisfied with their $250 earbuds. When the inevitable articles and YouTube comparisons come out asking, should you upgrade, and comparing last year's model to this year's, the case will be made that these are, in fact, worth the upgrade because they sound so much better than the previous generation. Here's another note from Reynold in the script. I also experienced my AirPods Pro 2 getting significantly worse noise canceling around this time. I used them several times a week at the same gym, same time of day, and went from not being able to hear anything around me to suddenly hearing the gym's terrible choice of music, people talking and metal clanking. To the point I found myself constantly checking if transparency mode had been enabled. On a flight where noise normally wouldn't have been an issue, crying children and a couple next to me were all audible with the music as high as 65% volume, at the point where playing it any louder would have been uncomfortable. I'm 100% convinced this was intentional on the part of Apple. Do I now own the AirPods Pro 3? Yes. Thank you, Reynold. Truly a stronghold of virtue. So I've always had an iPhone, like I said, since the 5C came out. Mostly just because it works best with everyone else that has an iPhone. You know, the market manipulation worked, to now everyone's pretty much got to have one. But I've always had weird problems with them in between models. Like every time a new iPhone comes out, it seems that mine coincidentally gets a lot worse and can't open Safari, and the battery starts to die quicker. And I think currently I have a 14. This is a 14 or a 13, I think. And I've had it since it came out, just because the last one got so unusable that I switched to whatever the newest was. And I'm going to continue to use this one until it becomes unusable. But it's just so many people use iPhones, and it works so much better for video sharing and data sharing that it doesn't make sense for me to get something else. But that being said, because Apple has had that issue, I haven't got any other Apple products. Actually, I take that back. I got a Mac for a while because I'm like, I need a laptop on the go. So I got the Mac, and I was so frustrated by everything being proprietary and none of the same programs working, and it being hard to swap between, like, you know, my home Windows setup and the Mac that I gave the Mac to someone else, and now just got a little HP omen because anything that isn't, you know, an Apple operating system. And for the same reason of like the product's not working, I've never gotten like Apple headphones or like Apple accessories. I always make sure it's different brands, right? But with what I have used, it's Apple, like the phone, I can definitely see the problem. I could only imagine if I got all the other products as Apple. But again, I'm a bit of a hypocrite because here I am with yet another iPhone and just said that I would get the next, because I guess cornering the market this hard really does numbers. It's a cheap trick to get us to buy the next latest and greatest. The firmware updates on them are 100% downgrading the active noise canceling. And don't let these people gaslight you. It's software, and Apple slowly rolls it back to make noise canceling less effective, are just a few of the comments on one popular post. A thread on the Apple community forum agrees, with one person concluding that they're, quote, no better than mediocre earplugs right now. You might think the solution to all this is to not update your AirPods and keep the old firmware. Well, the trouble with that is that Apple forces the updates behind the scenes. You cannot turn auto update off or stop them from updating, aside from just not using them. And sometimes not even then, as they'll still update in the case if they have battery and can connect to your nearby phone. For what it's worth, it's not just customers. Regulators and government entities are also growing tired of the cycle. Now they're looking to hold Apple accountable, not necessarily on a product-to-product basis, but their business practice as a whole. In 2022 and 2023, France's official consumer protection agency lodged a formal complaint against Apple, saying they've engaged in, quote, deceptive marketing practices and programmed obsolescence of its products. They added that Apple, quote, can detect unauthorized repairs that use unofficial parts and can remotely reduce repaired phones' performance. On the heels of that, in early 2024, the United States Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Apple, which suggests the business is engaging in anti-competitive monopolistic practices. The lawsuit alleges that, quote, to protect its smartphone monopoly and the extraordinary profits that monopoly generates, Apple repeatedly chooses to make its products worse for consumers to prevent competition from emerging. This includes that famous cultural blue-green bubble debate, in which the blue side is winning by a long shot. The lawsuit states that Apple, quote, made the quality of cross-platform messaging worse, less innovative, and less secure for users so that its customers have to keep buying iPhones. This anti-competitive behavior extends to their app store as a whole, regularly modifying the rules and restrictions for developers to put third-party apps at a major disadvantage over their own. According to the DOJ, quote, Apple meets competitive threats by imposing a series of shape-shifting rules and restrictions in its App Store guidelines and developer agreements that would allow Apple to extract higher fees, thwart innovation, offer a less secure or degraded user experience, and throttle competitive alternatives. This works hand in hand with another monopolistic practice that developers call Sherlocking. This term dates back to the early 2000s, when a new version of Apple's computer operating system search tool called Sherlock was inspired by, or in other words, copied, allegedly, features from a third-party search app called Watson. This essentially made Watson obsolete overnight. Apple continued and continues this pattern across all its devices, because their whole goal now is to design an Apple ecosystem that is sticky. In other words, hard to leave, easy to stay. Some examples are more blatant than others. In 2010, Apple removed Camera Plus from their App Store. This camera app allowed people to use the volume button as the shutter button. Just as it started finding traction among iPhone users, Apple pulled it off the market, saying it violated the development agreement. A few months later, Camera Plus was back in the store, but did not have the volume snap feature. About a year later, Apple introduced a volume shutter in their next iPhone operating system. In 2015, Apple removed F-Lux, an app that dynamically adjusted screen color temperature at night to reduce eye strain and improve sleep. They claimed it violated guidelines by using private APIs. Then a year later, Apple rolled out the night shift in their own operating system. In 2019, Apple released a feature called Sidecar, which Sherlocked a piece of software called AstroPad, made by a company that developed software for iPads to be used as a second monitor. AstroPad CEO Matt Ronge said, quote, because Sidecar is built into the operating system and uses system functions that AstroPad does not have access to, it's hard to compete with Apple. In 2022, TechCrunch started releasing an article after every World Wide Web developer conference with the title, The Apps That Apple Sherlocked at WWDC This Year. In 2024, it listed about a dozen apps that will likely no longer have a place in the world since Apple rolled out a host of new features across several of their devices. This included call recording and transcription, phone mirroring, window tiling, and custom emojis. For 2025, 8 Sherlocked apps were listed, including those for flight tracking, parcel tracking, and AI model integration. iPhones are now sold with about 40 Apple apps pre-installed, many of which serve as the default apps like Messages, Safari, and Photos. Several of them actually can't be fully removed. Third-party developers aren't just competing with each other, they're competing against Apple's own apps. As one developer put it, competing on iOS is like opening a coffee shop inside of a Starbucks. In addition to Sherlocking, Apple also has what it calls anti-steering rules, which ban developers from telling users about cheaper payment options elsewhere. Apps could not even direct users to their own websites. For example, this meant that if Spotify was having a promotion for a family plan, Spotify couldn't tell existing Spotify customers to check out the Spotify website. Apple did this because they take a 30% cut from every transaction that occurs through the App Store and didn't want anyone bypassing that. This fell apart in 2020 when Epic Games added its own payment system to Fortnite. Apple banned Epic and its hugely popular game, Fortnite, from its App Store. The ban ignited an intense legal battle that ended in 2021 when a judge ruled Apple could no longer block developers from informing users about outside payments. More significantly, after a 9-year investigation in March of 2024, the European Commission fined Apple 1.84 billion euros for abusing their power specifically when it came to anti-steering provisions. So Apple had to relax their anti-steering rules as a result. At the time of this ruling, Apple's net income was larger than any other company in the Fortune 500 and larger than more than 100 countries' gross domestic product. Their market cap was almost $4 trillion, a truly unfathomable amount. In a very telling statistic, in 2023, Apple spent $30 billion on research and development, the process in which tech companies invest in product design and function. In the same year, they spent $77 billion on stock buybacks, the process in which a company uses its cash to buy its own shares to boost their value. This makes it clear where Apple's priorities are here in the 2020s. The DOJ boiled it down to one conclusion. Apple, quote, has made its own products worse, sacrificing the short-term profits Apple could earn from improving the iPhone in order to preserve the long-term value of maintaining its monopoly. Despite Apple's motion to dismiss this lawsuit last June, as of today, it's still ongoing. All of this isn't to say that Apple's rivals are not without their own issues, both with products and business practices. But Apple does all of this so publicly and so visibly, a situation that's of their own design. They have invested billions of dollars in marketing campaigns, promising consumers that their products just work, that their competitors are clunky, unintuitive econoboxes that jack the refinement of an iProduct. They have often led with a design-first strategy to their products at the sacrifice of function, and sometimes charge so much for their products that their pricing has earned the nickname the Apple tax, or higher prices for products with fewer features and less impressive specs, just because it's got an Apple on it. Whether you believe this is fair or not, much of this reputation can be traced back to Apple's co-founder and late CEO, Steve Jobs, who, for all his brilliance, was notoriously narcissistic, arrogant, and often petty, and a pretty terrible father on top of that, in my opinion. This attitude formed the basis for Apple's entire approach to branding itself, which, to their credit, has worked on an incredible scale, but it also means their reputation for scandals and handling them relatively poorly is equally well earned. After all, you can't just forcibly upload a U2 album on everyone's iPods and not expect to get some blowback. The good news is that if you are now turned off from buying Apple products, which again is not my fault, Nokia has actually released an updated version of their famed 3310 model, and it does still have Snake. Just throwing that out there. And that should do it for a look back at Apple's many product controversies. Anyone who's owned an iPhone has had a negative experience with it, even Apple's biggest fans. So I think it's interesting in looking at the history of those experiences and how the company has handled it in most of the time not so great ways. But above all else, I just think it's interesting to talk about, and I'm glad that you thought it was interesting enough to stick around for, and we just want to say thank you for watching. Support on this channel has meant a lot. The support on the most recent Wendigoon video and the support over on Wendiglitch, it all means a lot. You guys are the best. New videos here Mondays at noon, so be sure to subscribe and stick around if you're interested. Everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description. Be sure to show them some love. And all in all, I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! And also, will I be trading my iPhone for a Nokia? Probably not, sadly. If the Nokia can do all the stuff I need a phone to do for work, then maybe. It's a nice thought. But I wish I could, because the snake thing does sound pretty cool.